Thank you very much, Meta, and again, certainly thank you and the scientists for peace who are putting on this series, and it's just tremendous to have you putting this on. So, in medicine nowadays, we're always concerned with conflict of interest. So I put up this slide, which says that I have none, and namely, I'm not being paid by the Atomic Energy Commission of Canada or any other people. But I certainly do have my biases. And as a politician, the former mayor of Kirkland Lake, back in the days when you tried to send your garbage up to us, and we prevented that from happening. So I certainly do have my biases, and these are some of the organizations that I belong to, basically environmental organizations. This is our vision with Physicians for Global Survival, which used to be Canadian Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. So, and I've based this on not only my research, but I've also been very fortunate to travel. I bicycled from Nagasaki to Hiroshima a couple of years ago. I was in Astana, Kazakhstan, and Semi, Kazakhstan a year ago. I've been to see the Henry Moore statue at Chicago, where Fermi had his first nuclear reaction. And so I've been fortunate to travel to a number of these places, and if people want to talk about that, we can do so later. Thank you very much. So, in Northern Ontario, we always say welcome, bienvenue, and also from greetings from our First Nation people. That's part of our the Northern Ontario School of Medicine way of doing things. So we take the quintessential Canadian moment, a crisp winter morning, and we've just come through February, the coldest month on record. The frozen pond, the crowd gathers for, of course, a spontaneous debate about health, uranium mining, and managing fissile materials. So we hope to have some fun here. I'm a Canadian. I did look at Jeremy Wilcox's presentation from a year ago. I didn't, Whitlock's presentation from a year ago, and he certainly talked to you about cobalt-60, and that was a Canadian invention, and I hope to do the same here, pointing out some of the Canadian things. How many of you have been coming to all these talks? So, a lot of you. So some of you then will find that some of this then is a review, Radiation 101, but hopefully I'll give you a different point of view on some of the other topics, namely mining. Kirkland Lake's a mining town, and we'll talk about the nuclear chain, which is what you have up there. We'll talk about the carbon footprint. We'll talk about costs and how it's all interrelated. We'll talk about accidents, miscalculations, terrorism, and secrecy. And from a medical point of view, I'm going to talk about the health risks of uranium in relationship not only to the environment, but also particularly to you as human beings. So one of the things that, hi, good to see you, we talk about is hibakushu, and these are the survivors of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. But we also believe that anybody who has been affected by radiation is really a person, hibakushu person. So what I'm going to talk about today are hibakushu people from not only Nagasaki and Hiroshima, but from mining, from transportation, from refining, from nuclear power, nuclear weapons, and testing. And I've handed around to you a little bit of propaganda there. The single sheet of paper, sort of the black and white piece of paper there that you have, gives you the, what do you call that, the HTML place where you can look up more information about this. This was prepared by the IPP&W students of Germany, and we had about 50 posters that we took from Nagasaki to Hiroshima. We showed them in Kazakhstan, and they explain what are the problems of radiation. And Dale Dewar, one of my colleagues, produced the posters on Saskatchewan, on Elliott Lake, and she also wrote, co-authored this book, which PGS turned out, and you can buy for $20.
Students have read it.
Perfect. Excellent. Okay. So we'll go over radiation. Again, it's simply energy waves traveling through space. Ionizing are the atoms that give up electrons and neutrons. Non-ionizing are the microwaves, your cell phones, electromagnetic. Fissile simply means that it's an atom that breaks apart spontaneously. Well, radiation does that, but it's also capable of being split in two. And so that's uranium-235. Thorium is not, and if again you want to talk about thorium reactors, we can talk about that afterwards. So in terms of, again, focusing on ionizing, we look at alpha particles. An alpha particle is actually, anatomically speaking, a very big particle. It's the helium nucleus. So it's 2 protons, 2 electrons, and when it smashes into the old double strand of DNA, it will take out both strands of DNA. If you're shooting beta is simply an electron, and it will take out maybe one strand, and this can be repaired. But if you take out both strands, that can't be repaired. So that's where we get into problems. Now, the nuclear people say alpha particles are not hazardous at all because they can be stopped by this piece of paper. The beta will go through the paper, but can be stopped by wood, and then gamma, of course, is the high energy one, which you need lead to stop.
Is your slide a little lower because it seems like something was missing at the bottom?
It said stop by lead.
Yeah, stop by lead. There we are. Okay, thank you. So, and again, we're talking about uranium 238, which is 99% of all the uranium that's in the ground. It has a very long half-life. I think you all know half-lives is when half of the material disintegrates to the next cascade product, or uranium daughter, and then you're still left with half. Then you then go through another half-life of that, and another half-life, and it takes about 6 half-lives to really get down to negligible amounts of a material. So then you've got uranium-235, which is less than 1%, but that's the critical part for most reactors and also nuclear weapons. And it's concentrated by centrifuging. And that's the problem in Iran right now, is they're busy centrifuging 238 and 235 to separate the two, but we don't know to what extent. And so if you're looking at, for nuclear power, it's somewhere around 2 to 5% concentration of 235. If you're talking about nuclear weapons, we're going up to 80%. So it's a time frame. And this is what the Israelis are doing, are monitoring the time that it takes for this to happen. So they're sort of getting quite antsy now because the Iranians have been doing this for some time. And so they're now thinking that the Iranians are starting to get up to that 80% concentration of 235. And when they have that, then they can make nuclear weapons. The other thing is, think of uranium as a big atom, and you break it in half. Now, you never break it exactly in half. So when you break it in half, you get products such as cesium 137, you get iodine 131, strontium 90, and again, you physics people, of course, know your periodic table. I've just put in that's the uranium decay. But if you look here at your periodic table, you can see up here at the top is K for potassium. And then just below that is CS for cesium. So therefore, you know that cesium in your body is going to act like potassium. And potassium is everywhere. So cesium is going to be everywhere. If you go over the next column, up at the top is calcium. And then right below that is strontium 90, is strontium. So you know, therefore, that strontium is going to get into your teeth, into your bone, and therefore will cause things like leukemia, which is made in your bone marrow. It will cause solid tumors of the bone, can dissolve your jaw, and things like that. So I just wanted to go over your periodic table. Radon gas, if you again go back there to the breakdown products of uranium, the uranium cascade, as we say, one of the products is radon gas. It's a heavier than air gas. It's given off by Mother Earth, and it concentrates in the lower areas. So if you live in a basement, you're probably going to be exposed to radon gas. And if you're a miner and are deep down in the mine, then you're probably going to have about 40 times the concentration of radon gas down there than you would have on the surface. Now, that's why ventilation is very important in mines and why they try to ventilate them. But again, it's not an exact science. And so you are going to have higher concentrations of radium gas down there. And it was actually a Kirkland Laker miner who did not smoke, who therefore developed lung cancer, and finally got the WSIB to agree that his lung cancer was due to radon gas and therefore was compensatable. So I'd like to plug these little Canadian things, in particular Kirkland Lake. And we now know that radon gas is the second most common cause of lung cancer after smoking. So that's, I think, is really saying something when we're the second largest cause of lung cancer. So we're going to talk about some general principles here. The people from the Atomic Energy Commission, they think that a little bit of radiation is helpful. Again, if you take a graph, for a little bit of radiation they think is helpful because it will stimulate your immune system, and it may cause some mutations, but maybe those mutations might be actually helpful. So that's where people from the nuclear industry are coming from. We doctors, on the other hand, feel that there is no safe level and that it is a linear, so that down here it is zero, so zero problems, zero concentration, and then as you increase your concentration, you also increase the problems with that. The nuclear industry, as I said, in talking about alpha, beta, and gamma particles, view it as external. And so therefore we'll say that an alpha particle is completely harmless. But we as doctors say that if you inhale it, if you ingest it, if you swallow it through your food or through drinking water, and it gets inside you, even though that little alpha particle only goes maybe a centimeter in distance, it can do the damage to your DNA. It's a big molecule or particle of a molecule, the helium nucleus, and therefore it can destroy the double strand of DNA, which therefore can't be repaired. You look at well, I'll go on to, we'll just zip down to time. Radiation is accumulative. So even though you are receiving very small amounts right now, background radiation, which is about 1 millisievert per year, it accumulates. So the longer you live, the longer you're going to have radiation in your body, the greater the chance for cancers. You have to look at the dose that you're exposed to, whether it's just background, and the length of exposure. So if you're living in a basement where there's radon gas and not a lot of ventilation, then you're going to be exposed to a higher amount for a longer period of time. There's also critical times is very important. So a fetus is much more sensitive to radiation than a baby, who is more sensitive to radiation than a child, who's more sensitive to radiation than a woman, who's more sensitive to radiation than an adult, male, your typical 70-kilo male. So, and again, the nuclear industry usually just looks at the 70-kilo male and doesn't seem to realize that certain of us, fetuses, babies, are much more sensitive. There's also organ sensitivity. So with Fukushima, people were worried about the thyroid, and that was iodine-131 that goes to the thyroid. I just talked to you about the periodic table, strontium-90 going to bone, cesium going throughout your body, replacing potassium. There's also hormone disruptors, and so where there is a high background of radiation, we often, or we sometimes see more boys being born than girls. Uranium is a heavy metal, and heavy metals have their own inert problems, so namely kidney problems. And then I've just thrown in racism, which is sort of a strange thing to put in on a graph like this. But a lot of what we, where uranium is mined is on First Nation lands. It's where we're, and I'll get to this more, the nuclear waste is being deposited in poor communities who are looking for the economic benefit. If you're a wealthy community, you don't want it. But if you're poor, then you may want it. So I've talked about external and internal. And there's a picture. Again, if you were here at Kathy Vakel's, there's her slide of the lung, and that's just being destroyed. radiation, alpha radiation, going out about a centimeter from a particle that has lodged in the lung that will then cause mutations and can go on to cause cancer. So again, you've got high energy, low energy. High energy, gamma, tends to kill, and that's what we use with cobalt-60. As doctors, we use radiation to kill cancer, and yet in low doses, it can actually cause cancer, and that's the alpha and beta particles. So we're looking at things like miscarriages, spontaneous abortion. It's often hard to detect, obviously, because pregnant women, they don't know when they're having a miscarriage often. Their period was a little bit late, it was maybe a little bit heavier, and so they think that's normal variation. But what we docs know is that when you're trying to get pregnant, you often are getting pregnant every cycle, but you are often having a spontaneous miscarriage. And when I was in Kazakhstan, one of the speakers was a lad, a young man without any arms. And he was an artist. He was a painter, a mouth painter, or a foot painter. And he would go around and paint people in his town who also suffered from deformities caused by the radiation that as they lived downwind from the nuclear testing that the Soviets did back in the day. So it's like thalidomide, you know, same thing. Anencephaly, that means people are born without a brain, and we see that as a much higher incidence where people are downwind from nuclear bomb testing. We see a higher incidence of Down syndrome. Hereditary things are passed on. When I was in Kazakhstan, the local people, they would feel the earth tremble under their feet, and they were told by the authorities that that was just an earthquake, when in fact it was testing nuclear weapons. When they got sick, they went to a treatment center, and right on the door was brucellosis treatment center, which you know, of course, is a disease from cows, but you know, it's not that well known, so that's what they were told they were suffering from. And it wasn't until 1991, when Kazakhstan received its independence, that the truth came out, and that they were then told by the Kazakh government that no, the earthquakes were nuclear test bombs being tested just down the road, and that no, you don't have brucellosis, you have radiation sickness. And so again, the nuclear industry tends to keep people in the dark because they don't want you to panic. And then I just throw in the cost there, $150 million to clean up the site, to secure the plutonium so that it wouldn't be captured by terrorists. You also get leukemias, thyroid nodules. Right now in Fukushima, there's a lot of much higher incidence of thyroid nodules, and some of these are going on to develop into thyroid cancer. It's not only sort of these genetic things, but it's also things like mental disorders. Depression is more common. Cardiovascular problems, heart attacks are more common in people who are exposed to radiation. And as a result, they die prematurely. Now, certainly I see people dying of heart attacks, but in their 40s or 50s. But if you're downwind or close by areas where you've got radiation, then that may be one of the complications. On the other hand, if you are exposed to a high dose, which is usually gamma radiation, as in a post-bomb situation, these are the symptoms that you'll experience. So again, not unlike chemotherapy or radiation therapy that we doctors give you. We monitor your blood counts and they go down. We monitor you. You often lose your hair. You get diarrhea, nausea, and vomiting. And as you can see, as the concentration of radiation goes up, the consequences are much more severe until you get to death. So let's go on to the fuel chain, which is starts with mining and goes right on down to nuclear weapons. Here's Canada, and if you look up at the top there, you see Radium City, or Port Radium, and then Uranium City down there. Northern Saskatchewan is where we currently are getting our uranium right now from Rabbit Lake, from Key Lake, Chalk Lake, and the MacArthur mine. And then it is transported from there down to Blind River, where it is refined, and then it's trucked down to Port Hope, where it again is further refined, and then it goes into the nuclear reactors along with the fuel rods at the Bruce, at Pickering, and at Darlington here in Ontario. And of course, you're from Toronto, and these are just down the road. So if there's a problem, you're going to get it. Again, this is again just another sort of representation of again, you can't quite read it, mine there up at the top, then mill, then refining, and then it's the fuel fabrication, which is in Port Colborne, and then it goes to the nuclear reactors, and then you're ended up with the spent fuel, high level. In the States is where that blue box is in the middle, and so they, for their nuclear power, they need enriched uranium, so it has to go there and goes into the bombs. Now, I'll just sort of focus, because we're talking about mining, and for the Kirkland Lakers in the group and other northerners, the first thing you have to do is find the mineral. So you prospect. Caminco, which is the large Canadian uranium company at the moment, spent $90 million prospecting in 2013 worldwide. Then you have the cost of building a mine. You also, so these are the mines that are up in northern Saskatchewan. Then you do some milling on site. For uranium, it's the creation of yellow cake. Then you do the refining, as I said, and the conversion. I found it sort of interesting that one of the largest enriching places is Springfield in the UK, but of course you all know it from where Simpson works in the States, Springfield. So that's where they got the name, I'm sure. And then you get into the fabrication of the fuel cells. Gilbert Labine, for again you miners, up my way, he first found silver up in cobalt. Cobalt, of course, is also cobalt-60. And back in the day, I was surprised to learn that cobalt actually cost about $65 an ounce, and gold was about $15 an ounce. So cobalt or silver cost more than gold did back in those days. Of course, not now. He then went on up to the Northwest Territories and found Port Radium. And uranium at the time was a byproduct and a waste product. What they were interested in was the radium for your watch dials so that it would glow in the dark. And then it was also sold by doctors, in quote, the snake oil docs, who would tell you all the medical benefits of radium. And various people took it, and then some people thought that if a little is good, a lot is better, and then died as a result. And I think Vinay, who just walked in here, gave a talk a couple of weeks ago, again about nuclear crisis and not only the Cuban Missile Crisis, but I don't know if you touched on some of the other types of disasters that occurred. Gilbert Labine, then again as Whitlock last week was talking to you about, back in the day he was the minister of everything, and he got Labine to buy back all his shares. He then expropriated them, the company. The company then became a government company. He then had RCMP check out all the workers for their views on communism, making sure that they were anti-communist and loyal to the crown. And then they could work in the mines, because this was all top secret, because this was all part of the Manhattan Project. And all of our Canadian uranium up until 1963 went directly into the manufacture of weapons. So it didn't go to nuclear power, it went to nuclear bombs. So, and now of course you have a cleanup. They thought it was going to cost about $24 million to clean up the Gunner mine. And so the feds would contribute $12 million. The province of Saskatchewan would contribute $12 million. Poor old Saskatchewan is now up to $60 million and still counting in terms of cleaning up this one mine, just one mine. And we've still got several other mines that are operating in Saskatchewan, and they haven't cleaned it up yet. The companies, El Dorado or the feds, they're not paying for the cleanup. They just get the profit. And then it's us as citizens, and through our taxes and through our electricity bills, that pay for the cleanup. You look at accidents up in Kirkland Lake or just outside. The wall sloughed down and buried a Euclid truck on one occasion. So these things do happen, and they can be quite massive. A Euclid truck's a big truck, and it was completely buried, and that then affects the permeability of the mine. And so therefore can contaminate the groundwater. Rabbit Lake had the highest uranium discharge into the environment in 2010. Again, we learned about this when we were looking at the Adams mine. Golder admitted to that. Canada produces about 25% of the world's uranium. We used to be number one. Kazakhstan is now number one, but there's contamination of dust and air, radon gas we've talked about. There's a lot of water that is used in mining. It's used in cooling, it's used to make yellow cake, it's used to cover tailing ponds. 1 ton of yellow cake results in 1,000 tons of tailings, and these are all radioactive. So you get soil contamination. And as I mentioned, unfortunately, a lot of this occurs on indigenous land. In the US, 50% is First Nation people, and of course they refer to it as sacred land, poisoned people. again, so they then become the hibakusha. In Elliott Lake, here in Ontario, we ended up with 12 mines. Elliott Lake in its heyday had about 25,000 people. It's now down to about 6,000 people, are elderly, who will die of old age before they die of cancer, but probably would not be the place to go if you were a young mother. Dr. James Ham, you Toronto people remember him as the 10th president of this university. And he headed up the Ham Commission because the miners in Elliott Lake went on strike in 1974 because they were having a much higher incidence of lung cancer and silicosis. And so he looked into it, made 100 recommendations, and 5 years later they finally got the Ontario Health and Safety Act, which gave miners and other workers the ability to refuse to work if they felt that working was unsafe. He noticed that there was 81 people who actually had lung cancer, and they expected to have 45. So almost double the incidence of lung cancer in Elliott Lake from the uranium mining. There was a report out of BC which did some uranium mining, and they found over a period of time 274 people had died of lung cancer. So a BMJ report found 3 times the increase in lung cancer. In Elliott Lake, they unfortunately built houses out of the waste rock from the mine. The waste rock, of course, was radioactive. And so when Bob Azumi bought up all these houses in Elliott Lake and wanted to sell them to the elderly, they had to raise the standards. So the standards normally is that you, the public, can be exposed to 1 millisievert of radiation per year. In Elliott Lake, they had to raise it up 20 times to 20 millisieverts because that's what they were going to be exposed to by living in these houses that were built out of radioactive rock. So, I mean, these are just sort of some of the follies that happen. These are, again, some of the accidents that happen in Elliott Lake. And again, the problem is that we haven't really done any studies on the survivors. It's Harper's idea that if you don't have scientists then to study a problem, then you don't have a problem. So we Physicians for Global Survival and the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War feel that the way to prevent a problem is to stop it in the first place, and so therefore to have a moratorium on uranium mining. Nova Scotia, BC, Virginia already have them. Quebec currently is having a temporary 1-year moratorium on uranium mining, and we are putting on a symposium next month in Quebec City on uranium mining, and we hope that Quebec will make that a permanent moratorium. And so our strategy is to get other provinces to have a moratorium. This is a good time to do it because it's supporting the status quo. The only province where you're having mining is Saskatchewan. There's no mining anywhere else right now, so therefore you're not putting people out of work. You're supporting the status quo. So that's one of the things that we're looking to do. There's a list of anti-nuclear groups. Now we move on to transportation. one of the things is, again, where do accidents happen? Well, you have to move that yellow cake from northern Saskatchewan down to Blind River, and you do it by trucking it over the roads. And they did a study on and pulled 102 trucks off the road and inspected them, and lo and behold, 16 did not measure up and had to be removed off the road immediately. And then they found another 9 that also had various deficits, and they had to get those fixed. So these are trucks that are moving radioactive material, and you're looking at 1 in 7 trucks overall, or actually that had to be removed off the road, and 25% of trucks had a problem. In Northern Ontario right now, you've heard in the news about the oil spill in Gogama, which is again just around the corner from where I live in Kirkland Lake. We've had 4 rail derailments this year. In 3 months, we've had 4 derailments. 2 of them were in Gogama. So again, if we're going to be moving radioactive material, is this going to be a problem? We're looking at, again, refining, and again, the Hibakusha of Port Hope, the increase in tracheal cancers and lung cancers, and again, my colleague Kathy Vakel a few weeks ago went through all these studies with you, and so I'll just sort of mention them to you. In Canada, we don't do any enriching. That happens to be down in the States. But my wife and I went down to Paducah she went to a quilting conference and found out that they couldn't drink the water because it was contaminated with radioactive waste in Paducah. So you look at power generation, different types. CANDU, of course, is the Canada deuterium uranium reactor. There's 44 in the world in 7 different countries. We've got 18 of them here in Ontario and 1 in New Brunswick. Quebec got rid of their Chantilly power stations just last year. And of course, these reactors are very good at making plutonium, making tritium, and use heavy water, both of which go into nuclear bombs. So again, nuclear power is 15% of the world's electricity. It's about 57% now here in Ontario. But if you look at our large province, equal sort of province next door, Quebec, it's 0. So, why the difference? And is it not possible that Ontario could follow Quebec's lead and use hydro to a much larger extent? We could buy electricity from Quebec Hydro for a lot cheaper than we're using to manufacture it from nuclear power. Again, there's accidents that occur. In terms, just generally speaking, when you look at a risk, you need to look at the frequency of that risk. And luckily for nuclear, the frequency is very low. But you also need to look at the consequences. What happens if you do have a problem? And of course, the consequences is very high. And what is going to cause these consequences? And one of the things we know here in Lake Ontario about zebra mussels, but one of the newest problems that blocks the intake areas for sucking up all the cooling water that's used in nuclear power plants is now jellyfish. Who would have thunk it? But because of climate change, the water temperature is rising. The predators for jellyfish are decreasing. Jellyfish are now multiplying like crazy and are now blocking up the intake channels for nuclear power stations. So again, Canadian, Malcolm Gladwell says that often it takes 7 mistakes to create a major mistake. He wrote that book called The Outliers. And so in one sense, that's a good thing that it takes 7 mistakes to make a big one. But unfortunately, that does happen. And an accident anywhere is really an accident everywhere because the radiation goes around the world. And Hans Elfven, Nobel Prize in Physics, stated that nuclear power is perfectly safe if there are no acts of God. And then I would also add, if there's no human error as well. So people often say, well, you know, here in Canada we haven't had any problems. Well, unfortunately we have. Back in Chalk River in 1950, we had an accident. It killed 1 person. 5 others got high doses of radiation. Jimmy Carter to the rescue, along with a whole lot of other Americans, came and participated in the cleanup. And again, the people, of course, was not told anything about that because they didn't want to cause panic. Just 8 years later, they were moving a fuel rod. It caught on fire, it fell, it broke, and again created a lot of radiation in Chalk River. They needed 600 people in the cleanup for that one. And some of the people, they were all sort of military people, like this corporal, took this oath of secrecy. And then, of course, he developed cancer. He tried to get compensation for it. There was, quote, no record of it because he couldn't tell about it at the time, and there was no records of it until AECL said, yes, unfortunately, we did have a problem. And so it was finally recognized. There's some accidents at the Bruce. There was an electric arc which destroyed the pipes. And again, at last week's lecture, you talked about the different types of pipes, the high pressure pipes inside the caldera, which is that big round thing with all the pipes running through it. They split open, had to be repaired, and so that was taken out of commission. And again, nobody would tell you how long it was out of commission for. The same thing happened in Pickering. Again, a couple of pipes broke there, and again, some other accidents. And then you look at the big ones that you know about. In Chernobyl, it depends, again, who you talk to. If you talk to someone from Atomic Energy, International Atomic Energy, they will say that 63 people died. You know, maybe it was 100 or so people died. If you talk to industry, they will admit maybe 4,000 people died. If you talk to Greenpeace, they will say a few more people died. But if you talk to this Russian, he has documented, gone through all the various Russian and Ukrainian documents, and he figures that there's been 950,000, probably over 1 million people have died prematurely. And so this is his book on that subject.
What's his name?
I'll let you pronounce it. You're much better at pronouncing things than I am, Meta.
Alexei Yablokov, Vasily Nesterenko, and Alexei Nesterenko. I didn't know about this. Very good.
So again, back in 53, Eisenhower delivered his Atoms for Peace, and again, Dr. Whitlock, I think, mentioned this last week. But this, again, sort of, to me, in my mind, what was his propaganda to alleviate public concerns over the nuclear bombs by saying, well, yes, we can turn it into peaceful uses, but it's actually the nuclear power that makes the products for the nuclear weapons. So, and by having nuclear power, they were then able to develop highly enriched uranium and send that around the world. Once you have a nuclear power station, it has a finite lifespan, about 20 years. If you then replace the pipes, then you can get up to about 40 years, and if you keep your fingers crossed and hope that things will be okay, you might even get up to 60 years before you need to decommission it. But so right now we're decommissioning the Gentilly 2 plant and Gentilly 1. It's obviously going to cost a whole lot of money. We don't know how to do it, so it's a learning example. But all of this is going to become nuclear waste. So you have high-level, highly enriched uranium, which is the fuel rods. And again, Dr. Whitlock was showing you last week your fuel rod and saying, well, you know, it only weighs 22 kilos and it's really not all that much. But these things go in, they come out, and so as a result, we are now up to a large number of these. 18,000 tons of these fuel rods are now being stored at Bruce Power. There's 2.4 million spent fuel rods. So it's a sizable amount. The other problem is that because you're getting radiation given off all the time, your metal components, your concrete are picking up radiation, and what do you do with it? Well, one of the ideas was to ship it off to Sweden, and then they were going to try to dilute it and put it into steel production. So another one is the Chalk River. It has a whole lot of liquid, highly enriched uranium, and they want to truck it down to Savannah, South Carolina. And so we've never trucked a liquid before. It's always been a solid, and as a solid, it's much safer. But we're now looking at moving a liquid by truck, and I've already talked to you about how some of those trucks are not even safe to be on the road. So you look at, we have this organization, Nuclear Waste Management Organization. They got 22 communities initially to say that they'd be interested in taking the nuclear waste. We're now down to 9 communities. The big one from here is to put it near the Bruce under Lake Huron. And of course, a lot of people think that's a bad idea because that may then pollute Lake Huron, which is where a whole lot of you get your drinking water eventually through Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. So, and there was an interesting article there in the Globe and Mail, and I just put up where you can read about that. That was just this past week. So you also look at depleted uranium. And so what do we do with it? Well, we can shoot it at our enemies. That's a good way to get rid of it. And of course, unfortunately, when it impacts into a tank, It burns, it creates dust, which is then transmitted by the wind. It may have caused the Gulf War syndrome. And then, of course, little kids play in these burnt-out tanks, and so they inhale the alpha particles and will develop lung cancer as a result. So, as I said, they make the ingredients, nuclear power makes the ingredients for nuclear weapons. We talked about the Manhattan Project. Again, a lot of the heavy water, deuterium and tritium was made in Trail, BC. The others was in Chalk River. And again, it was Canada that was the leader in nuclear in the 1940s and 50s. So we look at the hibakusha from that happened in the States, again because it was top secret. When they exploded a bomb, they didn't tell the public. The public got the radiation and got actually fairly high doses of radiation and got radiation sickness. And again, the public were not told about this because this was all top secret and we didn't want to create panic. And as I said, again, Harper is getting rid of the scientists, so no, if you don't have scientists to study it, then you don't have a problem. So Bikini Atoll, the Americans also tested in the Marshall Islands. It was interesting, the history, you think of bikini as something you women wear, which was designed by a French fashion designer. And he was looking for a name, and at this time the Americans were testing bombs over the atoll, and he says, bikini, that's a great word, hot, explosive. So that's how they got the word bikini for clothing, named after where they tested nuclear weapons. And the Marshall Islanders had last year launched a court challenge because taking the 9 nuclear countries to court because under of the Article 6 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, they are to work in good faith to get rid of their nuclear weapons, and of course have not done so. So the Islanders were suing them for, quote, breach of contract. Unfortunately, an American judge threw out their suit, and I'm not sure whether they're going to appeal or not, or whether they even can appeal. But that was sort of a problem. Again, when I was in Semi in Kazakhstan, the Soviets, they let off 456 nuclear weapons. The first 100 or so were above ground, so therefore greater radiation. And I've talked to you about some of the problems. I've talked about the different types of nuclear weapons, the fission, little boy and fat man. And then the H-bomb actually uses fission to create the fusion of the hydrogen bomb which is in the deuterium and tritium. So you look at the countries that have the bomb, and there they are. As I mentioned, the International Atomic Energy Commission has not done a very good job of preventing this from happening. They were, again, as I said, founded in '59, and you can just see all the countries that got the bomb after '59. The other countries there, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea, have not signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. You then have these countries that probably have American nuclear weapons on their soil. Canada used to have them. Again, up my way, the Beaumark missiles, just north of North Bay, There's a motel there called the Beaumark Missile Motel, because they were being stored in North Bay, which was our sort of NORAD command center. And I've actually been down there. And again, it was interesting because that was several years ago, but the huge room, bigger than this room, was filled with computers that was monitoring all the possible Russian planes that were coming over. And back in the day, all these computers ran on tubes. And where did the tubes come from? Manufactured in Russia. And they actually had to shut them down every 12 hours, and it went to a NORAD place in PEI while they would change defective tubes. So that's just the world with a few nuclear bombs going off. So in summary, I believe that we need to prevent nuclear war, miscalculations, accidents, terrorism by not mining uranium in the first place. There are tremendous costs to it. If you look at this whole nuclear chain, each of these steps, the mining, the transportation, the refining, the enriching, the building of the nuclear power plant, the decommissioning of the nuclear power plant, trying to get rid of the waste, each of these sites contributes to carbon footprint. You get the greenhouse gases given off in each of these stages. It's only when you're actually boiling the water with uranium that you can say that nuclear power is green. For all these other steps, that is not the case. And so you need to look at the big picture. You need to look at that all these steps are interrelated. It's all part of the interdependent web. And so therefore, you can't separate one from the other. You can't separate nuclear power just by itself, because you're still ending up with the waste, which then can go into nuclear weapons. I've pointed out accidents occur all along the way. There's miscalculations occur. Vinay talked a couple of weeks ago about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the other problems that have happened. The other thing is that we often don't realize that sometimes there can be political interference. So even though Dr. Whitlaw can design a perfectly, quote, safe problem and anticipate things, he may not anticipate things like jellyfish, but he may not anticipate political interference. And again, the head of Chalk River closed it down. Harper reopened it, fired her, and then a year later closed it down. So again, political interference is another problem that can occur. And then again, there's terrorism now. Back in my day, we just worried about the United States and Russia and the Soviet Union. Now we still worry about them in the Ukraine. And what's going to happen with the other Baltic countries, Lithuania, Estonia? Are the Russians going to move in there? We look at the whole Middle East. We look at Israel. We look at Iran, Iraq. We look at Pakistan and India. And India now is probably equally afraid of not only Pakistan, but also China. And then you've got the Koreas as well. So in my mind, we're actually at a much more critical time right now. And the atomic scientists have moved the clock from 5 minutes to midnight up to 3 minutes to midnight to reflect that. So I know a lot of you young people didn't live through the Cold War that Vinay talked about a few weeks ago, but actually I think we're in a much more dangerous time right now. And some people will say that deterrence works. Look, it's worked for 70 years. But a buddy of mine was saying, you know, why haven't we found any aliens out there? And his answer was that by the time they develop things like nuclear weapons, they destroy themselves, and that's why we haven't found them. So I'll bring that to a close. These are some of the things that you can do, and open it up for discussion.
Perfect. Thank you